All right, so before we sort of get into the takeaways, I just wanted to go back to the comment that we ended on, and Amy, you're going to help us a little bit. I think I sort of started talking about thinking about the roles that everyone plays. So everyone has their roles to play. And I'll just sort of use myself as an example, right? So I started in a migrant Head Start program. So I've been in programs and I understood what my role was as a program specialist, helping to support family child care providers. I then moved into advocacy and realized what that role looks like, right? And actually helped to write some of the 2007 Head Start reauthorization, including money for migrant and tribal programs, dual language learners, and some of this accountability stuff. And then I went into the federal government and then realized that, so I have a different role here. Like, my role is now no longer to advocate, but my role as a federal political appointee, civil servant, is really that now it's my job to figure out how do I best put together a system that Congress said you have to do. I also just sort of want to share a very personal piece of this to say that when the Head Start Impact Study and that GAO study came out, it was a really difficult time. And this may sound a little bit like a cop-out, but to be quite honest, DRS saved Head Start. I think that had we not moved forward and implemented a rigorous system, it would have been really easy for Congress to say, nobody takes this seriously, and we're either just going to flatline it or we'll slowly reduce it, which is some of what we saw on the child care side. We started to see some of those reductions too. So, I know that when Jeff put the data up, he started by talking about how the budget was at $5 billion. Today, the Head Start budget is over $9 billion. It is one of the largest federally funded programs in this country. And if you think about it, it doesn't go to states. It goes directly to communities, which is the other very unique piece. So you have a lot of buy-in from communities, from parents, from generations of families who have been through the program. So I want to say this, as somebody who has sort of seen Head Start at lots of different levels, one of the things that I really want you to think about as you hear a little bit more about what Jeff is talking about is think about the systems piece. So even for you at the local level, you have your systems, right? You have a TA system, you have a monitoring system, you have a professional development system, you have a finance system, you have an administrative system, transportation system for some of you who provide transportation. Try to think about how all of those things within your program function. Do they tend to function as silos? Or when you're trying to solve a problem, do you start to think about how one impacts the other? I will say that I think when we were designing DRS, yes, there were conversations about how this new system was going to be impacted by all these other systems. But the truth was that Congress did not mandate the federal government to fix the whole system. Congress said, you're going to do this one thing, and you're going to make it happen. Otherwise, we're going to rethink the program. So that's what the feds did. I will also just sort of throw a caveat out that remember that I am no longer in the Office of Head Start. So whatever I share or say to you, you can't go back to somebody in the feds and say, well, Yvette told me I could do that. No, like that doesn't fly anymore, okay? 2 years ago, anything, but not anymore. So I just want folks to keep that in mind. Keep in mind the systems piece within your program, but also how you're impacted by the bigger systems. And I would say in Head Start, our big systems are our TA system, which grantees get a portion of, but then we got this huge monstrosity on this side with our national centers. You've got your monitoring system, which is changing. It literally has changed almost every year in the last 8 years, right? Yes, yes. They're like, not, she's like, not, they're not in her heads, like, yes, 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 right? And we can talk a little bit about why that is too. And then also think about the program performance standards as it relates to implementation, comprehensive services, and I guess I would say, and sort of the influx of new early childhood programs, right? So you've got your local pre-K, you've got your state pre-K, and there are lots of conversations today about how does Head Start play in the sandbox with everybody else? So we've got all of these different things going on. So, sort of build on what Jeff is talking about, and then hopefully we'll have time to maybe get a little bit more into this systems piece, because we really cannot think of Head Start as a silo anymore. Even as we move into the next Head Start reauthorization, I can assure you, no congressperson will stand for talking about Head Start as Head Start alone. We're gonna have to have a conversation about how Head Start fits in with states and with local communities. So just kind of keep those pieces in mind as you're sort of building from the history.
Perfect. Thank you, Yvette. I know, exactly. Put your sheets on. So we've been talking about like really two opportunities for advocacy around DRS, right? One is we're going to have a new administration in 2017. The other is around Head Start reauthorization. And so the question is really about, how do we go about sort of talking about these systems pieces and sort of getting all of that to fit together, but also as we think about how we want to change DRS, what's the best ways in which to go about talking to members of Congress about changing? And so one of the things that I think about, and I think this might be my bias as a recovering researcher, is to think about it from a psychometric perspective, because it's like what you want fundamentally is a fair system, and sort of what is sort of the foundation of fairness is accurate measurement, right? And so when you think about a psychometric perspective, you're thinking really, for those of you who aren't researchers, psychometrics is really just this field of study that focuses specifically on the measurement of variables. And so, when you look at DRS through a psychometric lens, one is, are you really looking at those aspects of program quality that are most important to child outcomes and child well-being? Do you have the right constructs? And then the other piece is, how well are you measuring those constructs? Are you accurately measuring them? And so are you looking at the most important areas, and are those areas being accurately measured? And this sort of gives us a frame by which to think about how we might want to change DRS. And so what I did is I took those, the psychometric lens, and I applied it to the conditions. And so when you think about sort of, this deficiency condition, so if a Head Start program gets a deficiency, in its 5-year period, it is, it ends up being competed. And so from a psychometric perspective, what is, how valid is that? And it seems like, you have this issue with what they call construct validity. You're not measuring one thing with a deficiency. You're measuring like 1,000 different things. You can get a deficiency for all these different reasons. So you're not, and it sort of varies, there are varying degrees to which, there's some things that you might get a deficiency for that are less important or relevant than other things. And so, if you have a raging river with a hole in the fence, or a child left alone, or, that's different, a different, qualitatively different thing than if, you have sort of a unresolved non-compliance with a sprinkler head that's too tall. And so one of the things that's interesting is like NHSA, I think, has really good recommendations regarding deficiencies, and it's a good start in sort of the right direction. It's like, you can't just throw someone into competition because of a deficiency. What you do is you need to understand how quickly was it addressed, how severe was it, is this a systematic issue or a one-off issue, and so that's sort of one thing we want to continue to think about.
So can I just add something? So let me just add something. So I know, right? I'm not advocating for anything, but let me just say this. If you go back to the Head Start Act, it actually does define a deficiency as systemic. But keep in mind, the system is a human system. There are human beings who make these decisions, right? And so part of what happens is when your monitoring teams go out, which all of you know, they collect all of this information, a monitoring team will say, so we have all of this data. When it goes back to the federal office, it's the federal office who decides if it's systemic. And this word is actually in the Head Start Act. So Congress said, if it's systemic, it's a deficiency. Now, you can debate what that means and how it's defined, because whoever's sitting in that chair to make that decision can decide if it's systemic, right? So keep those pieces in mind.
Yeah. And then just to note, the letter from NHSA with those recommendations to Secretary Burwell from October 2015 is also in the Google Drive for this presentation. as will be these slides and PowerPoints.
Okay, so another condition of DRS is that a program has to set school readiness goals, monitor the progress towards those goals, look at data in the aggregate, look at data for individual children, individualize instruction based on the individual child assessment data, but also use the aggregate data for program improvement. It's like a very long condition. And what's interesting about this trigger is that there's no program that's ever been caught up or been asked to compete because they didn't have school readiness goals, right? And so for me, as someone who has done survey design, and so if you have a survey and you're asking questions, and you have a question that adds absolutely no value to whatever you're trying to figure out, what you do is you take it out, right? And so this is kind of something that we need to think about as for this trigger, because I think one of the things that Bridget said this morning and that we've been talking about is you don't want to think about class just as an accountability tool. You have to think about it in the way that it's going to help you improve your program, right? And so in thinking about that the class trigger and this one together is sort of the mechanism by which you would think about improving using data to improve your program. And so this is a complete tangent to the presentation, but I think we need to go this way for at least a minute. So essentially the way that, I thought about the school readiness goal, because I was part of the development of this one specifically for DRS, was, if you think about program quality almost like a regression, where there's a set of things that help you get to child outcomes, right? So you have, let me just go through this. You have, I don't want to steal the punchline here, but you have, what gets you to a child outcome? So you've got your child assessment, you're assessing children, and you find out that they're at a certain place developmentally. That's great because it tells you where kids are, but it doesn't tell you how the child got there. And so what you need to understand is what are those factors that move those child outcomes. And so you've got characteristics of the child. Is the child a dual language learner? Are they at risk? Are they, what's the nutrition and health of the child? What are the types and intensity of instruction and services? Like what kind of curriculum is being used, the assessments that are being used, how do they structure the day? How do they get connected to different social services? And then you've got, what does the quality of the classroom look like? And you've got these structural measures around the teacher credentials and the training of the TA and the ratios, making sure that those are correct. And then you've got these process measures that are measured by the class. And then you've got family characteristics that are also important. And all of these things together get you to child outcomes, right? And so what ultimately you're supposed to be doing when you're setting school readiness goals is you're supposed to be setting them and then looking at all these different things to say, if our goals did not get met, which one of those levers do I need to work on, if not all of them? And so when I think about sort of using school readiness goals and the data for program improvement, these are the types of scenarios that I think about. I'm gonna have to come over here because I can't see the screen. So and I don't want to block you either. But so essentially I just posed a couple of different scenarios. And so essentially, here's your findings from the child outcomes. So you didn't meet your math and literacy goals, but you have good class scores, right? And you have good staff credentials. So what is it that's making you not meet this goal? Well, it might be, you have low fidelity to your curriculum. You have a lot of dual language learners, but there aren't really good dual language learner supports. And so what you want to ultimately be doing is trying to take all the data that you have and putting it together to tell a story about your program. Okay, and that's what the school readiness goal trigger is about, and which incorporates the class.
So Jeff, are you saying it should stay or it should not stay?
Oh, it should definitely stay.
Yeah.
I wrote that thing. We gotta use it. We gotta, so we gotta use it.
But when you said nobody's ever been called on it,
right.
That makes me wonder.
Right, and the reason is that there hasn't been enough guidance, right?
Right, yeah.
So here's if you look at the issue really is the lack of guidance. It's it doesn't talk to you about how many goals are you supposed to set and what areas. Is it supposed to be, are you expressing it as thresholds or as progress? So is your goal that...
School readiness goal setting process was absolutely one of the most difficult things our program
Well, let's also be very honest, right? So I think that when Jeff talks about, let's be honest here. So when Jeff, which I agree with you, it is hard. But I would say that when you're thinking, so Jeff said something earlier that really stuck with me, which was about being unified around reform.
Yes.
Okay, so I'll be honest to say that as we were developing these school readiness goals, there was always a discussion around national outcomes. Right? Because programs across the country are saying, I don't know what this is, I don't know what this means. People were upset about the national reporting system, which actually had national outcomes. And I would actually venture to say that the only reason we were really against it was because it was a Republican administration versus a Democratic administration that put it forward. Because I will tell you, my first year at the Office of Head Start, there were many, many programs who called to say, do you still have that data available? Because it was the first time that we had actually measured child outcomes in a way where programs could compare themselves to other programs. Now, it was not developmentally appropriate, I will admit to that, but there was some usefulness from it. So, as we're thinking about school readiness goals, right, we're sort of having a conversation about national outcomes. Well, maybe it's time to think about national outcomes. Let me be very clear. It was the Head Start community who said, you cannot tell me what I should be measuring for my children. So it goes back to this idea, Debbie and I were having this conversation of the federal to local, right? So if this is a federal to local program, we have this culture and this value in Head Start. Because it is federal to local, grantees are going to do what's best for their children and their families. And that's part of the reason of what happened. Grantee said, you are not going to tell me what I'm going to measure. I'm going to figure it out. So, and I don't say that to put blame or anything, but it is critical for us to get to this idea of being uniform on what the next steps are. Otherwise, you end up in sort of this very crazy system, right, that we're all trying to figure out now. So keep that in mind.
And not that we opted out, but I think you would then start running, if you don't have come up with that, then you'll come to that system where you have more people like, oh, I'm opted out, or I'm coming on my own.
Yes.
Or doing that thing all over again. I think we'll never get to a real
Yes.
right?
But I'm also sort of the mindset of, I love what Bridget said earlier, and I love that Bob Chianta always says, like, you can't let perfection get in the way of trying, right? Which for me has always been like, we're not going to always set the right goals. Like, we're not going to. But the point of Head Start's longevity for 50 years, and it's likely going to continue for at least 25 more, is that you have the time and the opportunity to keep rethinking these things. So I would just sort of keep those pieces in mind. The last thing I would say, because I wanted to say this, was Jeff is right. DRS is not going away, and no administration is going to open up that reg. So if you want to change something about DRS, you're going to have to figure out how to go to Congress. And I'm just going to be quiet there.
Okay.
I'm just saying.
Yeah. Speak truth to power, right? So I think this whole outcomes conversation is really important, and it's a difficult one because it's really hard to hold programs accountable for child outcomes, right? Because there's just so many other things that are going on in that child's life outside of that program that's going to affect where that child ends up, and that's why when you think about, that's why you have to include all of these different pieces, like what's going on in that child's family, right? That's going to affect the outcome, and so. When you start thinking about child outcomes and accountability, that's where it starts to break down because you can't really hold the program accountable for sort of where the kids are, but you can use the data to figure out how you might want to help the family or, and any of these other things. I think, this notion of school readiness goals was appealing to me because it gives the program the opportunity to say, okay, here's where I am. And so when I've worked on this, on the school readiness goals trigger with programs that have taken it seriously, what we do is we go and say, let's look at your last 3 years of child outcomes data. And let's see where you're doing well. And then the other piece that we learned quickly is we have to separate out the children that aren't attending the program versus the children that are. So let's look at all the children, let's look at where you are. Now let's look at the kids that have at least participated in the program for 80% of the days of the program. and then say, okay, where are we systematically seeing strengths in your child outcomes? Where are we seeing weaknesses? And what do we, what sorts of other interventions can we apply to the children to help with those areas where there's weakness? And what do we think should be an expected outcome of that intervention? And that becomes the goal, right? And so, anyway, total tangent.
But I think, one of the things I think you point out, Jeff, is, at least in my mind, is a measurement problem, right? Because what you described just now is a continuous improvement process. It's not the outcome. It's it is a defined continuous improvement, rigorous continuous improvement process that leads to outcomes. But the problem is we're not very good at measuring that. And so what gets measured is, do they have outcomes? Can they say they're using new data? And that's easy to show on a compliance. Like, I always wanted to do this thing, the National Centers put out goals, and I'm like, how many Head Start programs goals are word for word?
I know,
those
exactly.
that came out of the center, only only because they, because it was sort of set up to be a compliance. I think it's just not because they were not trying to do it, but I just think that's the hard piece, is choosing measures that are really central to, and I think this is actually an area where I know the OUNCE is doing some work in this area, but we haven't even defined what that looks like at the program level in ways that I think we can measure.
That's exactly right, and I think that is the fundamental flaw with this goal, with this condition, is that we're just not measuring. We don't know what to measure and how. So, all right, anything else on that? Do you guys want to talk about that some more? A lot of opinions on that. That's not surprising. Okay, and then the class. I don't know if you guys know this. It's a classroom observation tool. It's one of my favorite jokes. Anyway, so so I did the same thing when I presented at Teachstone a few weeks ago.
Did they laugh?
Yeah, they did actually. politely. So essentially, what's so great about class, from a psychometric perspective, is it has such strong psychometrics, right? You've got hundreds of studies about this. It, not only is it measuring what it's intended to measure, but it has predictive validity. And I think, in this world where we're trying to, figure out how to improve child outcomes, and we have such a hard time measuring the outcomes, to be able to measure, those things that go on in the classroom that predict outcomes is really important. And I think, one of the places where we need to talk more is, this notion of the 10% threshold, and we talked about it a couple times already, where, that thing's a moving target from cohort to cohort, and you've got programs that, will score the exact same score in different cohorts. One might be in competition, one might not be, and so that sort of speaks to the issue of fairness. And also, this other piece, and Amy talked about it, we really need to make sure that it's being implemented as intended, right? Because we know that the class is a good measure when there's fidelity to the instrument, and we need to keep sort of working on that, right?
Jeff, one other just piece of history that I don't think you mentioned related to this 10% was the reason for that. As I understood it, this was not our creation, but I was on this crazy call with some folks who came up with it, was their concern that if you just set an absolute threshold, that everybody out in the field, the data collectors, will just say, okay, so you did say that.
No, I didn't, but we have something we're trying to figure out what we want to say.
If you have to get it a 3.0, then if I'm between a 2 and a 3, I'm just going to give you a 3 if I like you, or a 2 if I don't. Because everybody's sort of aware of that, so at least the 10% left some possibility that it would sort of protect against that. So that was the reason behind it. I think I totally agree with the problems with it, but there was an actual intentional reason for it.
Do you want to say about
No, I think that's right on, and I think this is one of those issues of unintended consequences, right? So at the moment, it seemed like the right thing to do in order to get to fairness. Looking back now, I think everyone would admit that there are some challenges, and as you think about continuing with class, thinking about this issue of the 10%, but also the thresholds of the 6 and the 7.
And what you're talking about that there is something that I think is often forgotten, that there is that safe haven of a 6 or a 7. Yeah. So I will often have conversations with folks who do say, well, what are we going to be, putting folks in DRS with a 7? No, we do have reason behind having that low, mid, high. that 6 or 7 is a safe haven once you hit that mark. The other thing that I think is important to say, and I'm not just putting out there to say, make some sort of a statement on behalf of Teachstone, but I guess I would go so far as to say the conversation has started at Teachstone about this last bullet there, or last statement. We have to ensure the observer support is second to none. And I think we're close, we're getting there, but we need to absolutely maintain that and make sure the field feels that. And along those lines, something that has always been an issue for me, and maybe it's coming from that slide where I said the teacher is central, is that we never have a teacher blindsided by a class observation. And I continue to have comments from folks on the Teachstone Trot this morning. Someone said to me, Amy, so often our teachers have no idea why that observer is in the classroom or what they're looking at. And I just think that's a fundamental baseline, and we have to get better about saying, this isn't a small suggestion to you, this is maybe mandatory guidance. I mean, you really need to be sure folks know what people are doing there and why they're there and what the class is about.
Is that potentiality for a data collection point when you have observers go into the room to ask one question like that of the teacher?
We've had that in data collection and studies where we did do surveys like that with the teacher, but currently no, and not within DRS. So that's something to consider. That's kind of an implementation facet.
And I think also that I would add to Amy's comments that I think one of the things that we know is, now we have what was quite honestly like something that was had a really long, this 80% within one, like that was what we used from research, the reality is there should probably not be one number because the degree to which we care about reliability depends on the way in which the tool is being used. So in the DRS, fairness trumps everything. So those folks really need to be trained to a very high level of reliability in a way that perhaps folks using it from a coaching perspective don't. So I think that it's not existing now, but I think it is a conversation that's happening. Are there ways that we can think about certification at different levels? I know that ACRS does this, that might address at least some of these issues.
Anything else on that? I just have one more question. Is there a way to find a sister element or two that would confirm a problem, like a bundle, or you know what I mean? I'm just curious of that type of thing, like that and a curriculum implementation indicator.
So I think it goes back to what Jeff was saying around the school readiness goals. Like, part of the issue is that these are not linked, and they should be linked, right? So the grantees, I hope most grantees are starting to see them aligned, but the feds still see them as individual triggers. So you don't compare data one for the other.
This also just from an implementation perspective, you've got this is from teaching strategies and the child assessment piece. This is from Teachstone. This is from COPA. So it's just really hard to bring all of these different pieces of data together and get them all on one line, so you can see everything that's impacting a child across these different data sources, right? So anyway, so that's really, my last takeaway is more like a question for you. It's like, can the field be unified in a strategy to make DRS better in the next reauthorization? So we know it's not going away, right? We said that a couple times. We know that really the true vehicle for change is going to be in the law more than it is from a regulatory perspective. So, what is it, if you could rewrite this, what would you want it to be? What things would you want? We know that the National Head Start Association would want to change the deficiency trigger. We know that. They've written a letter on that. But what else? Or we can also talk about anything you want right now. Whatever you want. Seriously. I can show you pictures of my children. So anyway.
Well, is there anything right now about CQI strategies or measurement of CQI implementation? And to all the researchers in the group? Like, is there a body of science that's informative?
So I think there is some work that Carnegie and others have done in the K-12 space that I think is what the Ounce is sort of pulling and building on. I think it's fairly nascent at that level in terms of being able to, it's not an area that I focus on.
I mean, I would say that one thing for folks to take into account, so it is this issue around being unified, right? And I do think that because Head Start is federal to local, which was the point, every Head Start program is supposed to look different. But the purpose of the performance standards was to give us some uniformity and some level of quality. But at some point, so I'll just sort of share this piece, that at some point though, we ended up so focused on the kid side that we sort of lost sight of the other things that we're supposed to be doing. So when you think back to the school readiness, to that outline, that nice outline you put up with the family characteristics and everything, like we did do the parent, family, and community engagement framework, but programs really get monitored on the child stuff, right? Like we sort of lost our 2-gen, I guess I would say, when we really want to think about outcomes for kids. We really thought, we're really to a point where we're like, it's all in the classroom, it's all going to happen with instruction, but we lost this other piece, which is where we really started, right? I mean, that was the whole point of what LBJ did, was to move people out of poverty. And I'll just sort of share that for me, one of the things that I find really hard is going to Head Start programs who have been around since 1965 and seeing generations of families coming through that same program. And we had a period, I would say in the 70s and the 80s, where we thought that was great. We had a kid, a mom, and a grandparent, and we were like, yeah. And I went to a program one day and I was like, never tell that story again. Like, that's not what you're supposed to be doing. Right? We lost that piece. But part of it is because I think we moved to such a child focus, because that's what everybody was looking at, right? Our kids were dropping out, they couldn't read and write, like, where are we gonna fix this? The research is telling us if you start early, kids will do better. So we move to this piece and we sort of lose our family side a little. And, Debbie and I were just talking about this, like you have these requirements around comprehensive services, but we don't really quite measure them in equal value because we're sort of really got the child up here, family here, and all the other pieces kind of right here. So when you're thinking about systems, is it time to start thinking about the system around comprehensiveness, and what does that mean at the local level?
That to make you feel better, maybe. I can say one of our observations in Virginia pre-K expansion, so there's 11 different school divisions. 4 of those school divisions have a history of braided or blended Head Start funding, right? Those programs by far, they have the highest class scores. They also are the programs that everybody's going to, because in our pre-K expansion, we agreed that we would have comprehensive services and we would have a family engagement coordinator. And in most school districts, no one knows what to do with that. And so they're drawing on our sort of learning community, and it's all the Head Start programs who are really serving as leaders within the state as pre-K expansion. So I think, I think it is, I get what you're saying, but I also think that there's still a lot, and I think the new pre-K expansion is sort of pushing some of the best Head Start stuff into schools in ways that is really, at least in Virginia, is really interesting.
No, I mean, I think that we see these models across the country, right? So you've got programs like DCPS, who 5 years ago decided they were going to blend their money. And, I think a lot of people across the country still think you can't blend, you can't layer. Like, nowhere in the law does it say that you cannot do that. But what happened was programs couldn't cost allocate, so the feds came down on programs, so programs were like, okay, we're not going to do that anymore, right? Instead of figuring out what our TA system should look like, so we could help programs blend and layer, and then they'd be fine in monitoring, and then probably you'd be raising quality for all of your kids. So I guess I just sort of just share those examples so that you can start to think about, like, as you think about reauthorization, so what does the system need to look like? right? And the whole idea, I will also say about systems and community, is that the idea wasn't that Head Start was supposed to do it all. Head Start was supposed to connect families with other resources, but then that puts pressure on programs to figure out like what's going on in the other system, right? Because if your family needs housing or transportation, now you got to go deal with somebody else, which can really be a pain. I get it. But then we turned around and we put, 45 days and 60-day, 90-day requirements, and if the community health center can't do it, you're going to get dinged if you don't do it, so you better figure out how to do it. I mean, so you sort of see how this all gets a little convoluted and crazy.
Well, and when you say convoluted, that's kind of listening. If DRS is about accountability, then that needs to be what we keep in our minds above and beyond all other things, So if the accountability piece for school readiness, what's that look like? Yeah. So.
Well, in Head Start, I would say it's all of these things, right?
Yes.
Like, it's not just that our kids can do their ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. It's that they're also good people and they help each other and whatever else, right? But all that other stuff, right? All that good stuff. But somehow, we're just measuring this piece.
Yeah.
Right? And our TA system tries to support these other pieces, but everything is so focused on this piece that when other TA parts try to do this, they get pulled into this. Right? I mean, keep in mind also, like, DRS is also something you can grasp, right? So, like, if you're a congressional person and you're like, yeah, we got DRS, like, this is good stuff. It's something you can point to. So, I think it's important to keep those pieces in mind. But I would just challenge people to think about a 21st century Head Start. What does that look like? What does it mean? And I would start by sort of challenging people to think about the values. So like, what are the values that we've carried for 50 years? What are the values that we want to continue with? And I think that you can maintain your values, but you also need to think about your program as it relates to modern families living in poverty.
Well, and another thought too, just throwing them out there, the fact that it is a $90 billion program, my biggest, and I've been passionate about Head Start since I started 25 years ago.
Yeah.
Love it, believe in it, but get furious when people spend their money poorly.
Yes.
We are not good stewards of the federal dollars we receive sometimes, and that's what I would rather see given more attention to, is people spending their money well and being good stewards and not buying junk or wasting it, or there's just a lot about that bothers me.
So there is a trigger on financial accountability, which a lot of programs, it's used a couple of times a year. But it does go back again to this piece around, if you're doing well on this piece, then we're going to assume that you're doing well on these other pieces, right? Yeah. Which is kind of a problem because that's not always true. And that's really where you sort of find those programs who have been lying low for a while and then it blows up. But I would totally agree with you. I think that programs need more guidance on how they spend their money. There's also this issue, and I'll just bring it up, around quality versus quantity. So we had this thing in the 80s and 90s where we let everybody in because that's what we do. We're a local organization. We're going to serve everybody who is eligible. But the thing I try to tell people is, like, Congress doesn't fund us to serve every eligible child, right? But that's why the law and the rules say that it's up to a community within these confines to then determine who are the neediest families. So in your community, they could be disabled families, homeless families, families who are dealing with other issues. That's really up to programs, right? But we've gotten ourselves in this cycle now where nobody wants to see those numbers go down. So even as new money is coming into the system, it's all about serving more and more kids. But at the same time, we're asking programs to serve more kids and raise the level of quality. And so that's a...
And year round.
And year round. And we're going full day. We're going full day year round.
More kids.
Right? I mean, there's all of these factors that play into it. And so I guess, again, I would just say, like, you cannot think about these things in its own little silo. You have to think about the whole program because it's all layered upon itself. every piece impacts another piece, whether indirectly or directly, and you're going to feel it at the local level.
And I would say, like, we have like partnerships with the ISDs.
Yeah.
And having those partnerships with the ISDs, it's good because we're partners in our communities. However, when you get a teacher in ISD who has to work side by side with the same responsibility as a grantee Head Start teacher, and then they start, of course, you're not comparing pay,
Right.
but they're not nowhere near equitable as far as pay. So then you have this teachers like, you get that behavior that sometimes will then start affecting this here. So therefore, you're having that, we're like doing one thing, but then we're not really maximizing and utilizing those funds the way we should and could be. What you're saying, I think.
I mean, I would just add, I don't know what people saw it, but not everybody's a fan, but Sarah Mead from Bellwether Groups wrote an article in USA Today calling for a Department of Children and Families, which we did have many, many years ago, right? HEW, which went away, and then we got the Department of Education. But I would just say that one of the other things you have to think about besides Head Start is sort of how we make policy in this country. So I can't tell you, like, in the last 10 years how many panels I go to, and the workforce people are bitching about the early childhood people, and the state people are bitching about the health people, and the health people are bitching about the Head Start. Like, everybody is sort of not happy with each other, but nobody has really sort of stopped to say, like, why isn't this working? And why is it so hard for a Head Start program to get families to a community health center, which is supposed to be serving the same families that we serve? So,
Yeah, well, on that note, we're like,
Amy gets the last one.
Empowering note.
I'm going to give you a bad cell phone.
No, don't do that. So you know what I would
It's a
say?
great
No,
note.
here's what I would say. So I would just challenge people to really rethink about, so let me say this. So LBJ started a revolution 50 years ago, right? Forcing us to think about poor families in this country. I would just sort of put this challenge out to people for you to start thinking about a new revolution around how we serve poor countries in this family. Because his goal was that poverty would be diminished, and it hasn't. It's only going up. Right? It still continues, especially for our families of color and our kids of color. And so what's the answer? And maybe it starts in this room, right? I'm all about a revolution now. But maybe it starts in this room, right? About thinking about what do we do, like what is it that kids and families and communities, because that's the point of Head Start, communities. What is it that communities need to move families up?
So maybe those big ideas send to Yvette. I'll have her email. And then the little smaller tweaks that we might be able to make in terms of supporting observers, in terms of supporting teachers, so they're never blindsided by an observation, some of those smaller things that we talked about, please do send them our way, because we are absolutely committed to being a partner in change and in supporting Head Start community to make the DRS system work. So, and to build on what was already started, and it has many, many benefits for all children and families. Thank you all, and have a wonderful comment.